We are tasked with configuring and securing the network environment by deploying a virtual machine to configure and ensure that all network traffic flows correctly through this setup. The main objective is to achieve robust security for our environment. What should we configure? A system route. B, a network security group. C, a user-defined route. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To ensure all network traffic is routed through Azure Virtual Machine, the appropriate configuration involves using a user-defined route. This allows for precise control over how data flows through VM1, ensuring that external connections are correctly directed to specific in-port and out-port configurations. Our Azure subscription includes 100 virtual machines that have Azure Diagnostics enabled. We have been tasked with retrieving the identity of the user that removed a virtual machine 15 days ago. We have already accessed Azure Monitor. Which of the following options should we use? A. Application log. B. Metrics. C. Activity log. D. Logs. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To retrieve the identity of the user who removed a virtual machine, the activity log provides records of operations performed on resources in your Azure subscription, including who performed the action, what action was taken, and when it occurred. We have been tasked with enabling advanced threat protection for an Azure SQL database server, ensuring it is configured to identify all types of threat detection. What will happen if an application generates a faulty SQL statement in the database? A potential SQL injection alert is triggered. B, a vulnerability to SQL injection alert is triggered. C, an access from a potentially harmful application alert is triggered. D, a brute force SQL credentials alert is triggered. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. When a faulty SQL statement is generated in an Azure SQL database server by an application, the Advanced Threat Protection feature within Azure's Security Vision API detects potential SQL injection vulnerabilities. This detection is part of the threat detection process, which includes identifying SQL injection attacks, even if the specific vulnerability is not exposed yet. The alert triggers when such attacks are present, highlighting a need for further security measures to prevent malicious execution. We use Azure Security Center for the centralized policy management of 3 Azure subscriptions. We employ several policy definitions to manage the security of the subscriptions. We need to deploy the policy definitions as a group to all 3 subscriptions. We create an initiative and an assignment that is scoped to a management group. Does this solution meet the goal for us? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Creating an initiative and assigning policies scoped to a management group in Azure ensures that each subscription's set of managed policies is automatically grouped together, allowing the same policy definitions to apply across all managed subscriptions without needing additional policies for each subscription individually. We have an Azure virtual machine. From Azure Security Center, we receive the following high-severity recommendation: install endpoint protection solutions on the virtual machine. What should we do to resolve the issue causing the high severity recommendation? A. Add the Microsoft Antimalware extension to virtual machine. B. Install Microsoft System Center Security Management Pack for endpoint protection on virtual machine. C. Add the Network Watcher agent for Windows extension to virtual machine. D. Onboard virtual machine to Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Adding Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection provides a comprehensive threat management solution integrated with other security services. This would address the need for advanced protection features necessary for full security coverage on virtual machine. Other options like installing specific extensions or tools may cover some aspects but lack the breadth needed for high-severity recommendations, which likely require a broader threat management approach. We enhance our hybrid Azure AD configuration by ensuring Active Directory accounts are utilized for authentication across Windows 10 computers. We manage the Azure SQL database, enabling it to authenticate via Active Directory on premises. Our strategy must minimize the need for authentication prompts. Additionally, we ensure that database developers leverage our on-premises Active Directory account for authentication. A strategic objective is to enhance security and operational efficiency by maintaining minimal authentication overhead while ensuring Active Directory accounts are utilized throughout the system. Which of the following is the authentication method the developers should use? A. Azure AD token. B. Azure multi-factor authentication. C. Active Directory integrated authentication. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The optimal authentication method for the SQL database in this hybrid Azure environment is Active Directory integrated authentication. This approach ensures that all connections to the SQL database are managed through Active Directory, keeping everything on premises and maintaining user trust. While it adds complexity with additional security layers, it provides a seamless transition from Azure AD and aligns with the requirement of using an Active Directory account for authentication. Therefore, despite potential security considerations, Active Directory integrated authentication is the recommended solution. We have an Azure subscription. We create an Azure web app named Contoso 1812 that uses an S1 app service plan. We plan to create a CNAME record for the URL that points to it. We need to ensure that users can access it by using the URL. Which two actions should they perform? A. Turn on the system assigned managed identity for it. B. Add a hostname to it. C. Scale out the app service plan of it. D. Add a deployment slot to it. E. Scale up the app service plan of it. F. Upload a PFX file to it. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To set up the correct actions for accessing Contoso 1812 is B and F. We have 10 virtual machines on a single subnet with a single network security group. We need to log the network traffic to an Azure storage account. What should we do? A. Install the Network Performance Monitor solution. B. Create an Azure Log Analytics workspace. C. Enable diagnostic logging for the network security group. D. Enable network security group flow logs. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. D. Enable NSG flow logs. We have an Azure subscription, which is linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. We are developing a mobile application, which uses the OAuth 2 implicit grant type. We need to register application in Azure Active Directory. What information should we obtain from the developer to complete the registration? A redirect URI. B, a reply URL. C, a key. D, an application ID. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. For native applications, you need to provide a redirect URI, which Azure Active Directory will use to return token responses. We manage an Azure subscription that includes a user and an Azure Container Registry. We have enabled Content Trust for registry and need to ensure that the user can create trusted images while following the principle of least privilege. Which two roles should we assign to the user? A, Acra Core Antenna Reader. B, Contributor. C, Icra Push. D, Acra Magesigner. E, Acra Core Antenna Writer. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To ensure user can only create trusted images in registry using least privilege, assign these two. We have recently been granted access to a new Azure account, which we are tasked with ensuring the specified user can successfully implement Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. Which of the following is the role we should assign to the user? A, the Compliance Administrator role. B, the Security Administrator role. C, the Password Administrator role. D, the Global Administrator role. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To start using privileged identity management in your directory, you must be a global administrator with an organizational account to enable it for a directory. Our network contains an Active Directory forest. We also have an Azure Active Directory tenant with the same name. We plan to set up synchronization using the Express Settings installation option in Azure Active Directory Connect. We need to determine which roles and groups are required to perform this configuration while adhering to the principle of least privilege. Which two roles and groups should we identify? A, the Domain Admins group in Active Directory. B, the Security Administrator role in Azure Active Directory. C, the Global Administrator role in Azure Active Directory. D, the User Administrator role in Azure Active Directory. E, the Enterprise Admins group in Active Directory. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. When configuring Azure Active Directory Connect with the Express Settings option, the process requires elevated privileges in both on-premises Active Directory and Azure Active Directory to ensure proper synchronization and configuration. We have been tasked with configuring an access review, which we plan to assign to a new collection of reviews. We also have to make sure that the reviews can be reviewed by resource owners. We start by creating an access review program and an access review control. We now need to configure the reviewers. Which of the following should we set reviewers to? A, selected users. B, members self. C, group owners. D, anyone. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. If the resource is a group, they need ask the group owners to review. The task involves applying conditional access policies within Azure Active Directory. The process includes assessing both risk events and risk levels. Additionally, it seeks to determine which specific risk level should be configured for sign-ins originating from IP addresses with dubious activity. A none, B low, C medium, D high. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The correct risk level for signs in originating from IPs with dubious activity on Azure Active Directory is medium. We have an Active Directory forest with a single domain. We also have an Azure Active Directory tenant with the same name. We have been tasked with integrating Active Directory and the Azure Active Directory tenant. We intend to deploy Azure Active Directory Connect. The strategy for the integration must ensure that password policies and user login limitations affect user accounts that are synced to the Azure Active Directory tenant. Solution: we recommend the use of federation with Active Directory Federation services. Does this solution meet the goal for us? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Incorrect. We have been tasked with delegating administrative access to our company's Azure Key Vault. We must ensure that a specific user can set advanced access policies for the Key Vault while adhering to the principle of least privilege. Which of the following options should we use to achieve this goal? A. Azure Information Protection. B. Role-based access control. C. Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. D. Azure DevOps. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To achieve the goal of delegating administrative access to a specific user for setting advanced policies based on least privilege, the appropriate option is role-based access control. It allows users to be assigned roles or privileges within an organization. It ensures that only authorized individuals can perform certain actions in the Azure Key Vault. The principle of least privilege means that access is granted only when necessary, preventing unnecessary access for less critical roles. We have an Azure Active Directory tenant. We need to configure diagnostic settings to meet the following requirements. Retain logs for 2 years. Query logs using the Custo query language. Minimize administrative effort. Where should we store the logs? A. An Azure Event Hub. B. An Azure Log Analytics Workspace. C. An Azure Storage Account. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The optimal solution involves consolidating log storage within an Azure Log Analytics workspace, as this centralizes logging operations and reduces administrative overhead. We have a hybrid configuration of Azure Active Directory. We have an Azure Storage account with a file share named General Blob. We plan to allow users to authenticate to General Blob using our Azure Active Directory credentials. We need to configure the environment to support the planned authentication. We deploy the on-premises data gateway in the on-premises network. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. It is incorrect. We have an Azure subscription that contains several Azure SQL databases and an Azure Sentinel workspace. We need to create a saved query in the workspace to find events reported by Advanced Threat Protection for the Azure SQL database. What should we do? Well, from Azure CLI run the Get as Operational Insights workspace command. From the Azure SQL database query editor, create a Transact SQL query. From the Azure Sentinel workspace, create a Custo Query language query. From Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio, create a Transact SQL query. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To create a saved query in the Azure Sentinel's workspace, to find events reported by Advanced Threat Protection for an Azure SQL database, the best approach is create a Custo Query language query. Custo Query language is specifically designed for Sentinels and can directly handle queries without sending results back out. This makes it ideal for creating event sourcing queries that trigger alerts or feed into the cloud function required by Sentinels. We have 3 on-premises servers running Windows. First 2 are on the internal network, while server 3 is on the perimeter network. All 3 servers have access to Azure. From Azure Sentinel, we install a Windows Firewall data connector. We need to collect Microsoft Defender Firewall data from these servers for Azure Sentinel. What should we do? Create an event subscription from Server-owned, Server 2, and Server 3. Install the on-premises data gateway on each server. Install the Microsoft agent on each server. Install the Microsoft agent on Server-owned, and Server 2. Install the on-premises data gateway on Server 3. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To collect Microsoft Defender Firewall data from on-premises servers and send it to Microsoft Sentinel, you need to install the Microsoft Monitoring Agent on each server. This agent collects logs and forwards them to Azure Monitor, which Microsoft Sentinel uses for data ingestion. We suspect that some users may be attempting to access resources they are not authorized to use. To verify this, we plan to create an Azure Log Analytics query that detects unsuccessful user sign-in attempts over the past few days. Our objective is to ensure the results only display users who have experienced more than 5 failed sign-in attempts. Which of the following should be included in the query? A. The event ID and count of parameters. B. The activity ID and count of parameters. C. The event ID and count parameters. D. The activity ID and count parameters. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The appropriate query parameters for detecting users who failed to sign in more than 5 times are event ID and count. We have an Azure virtual machine that runs Ubuntu 16.04. We plan to deploy and configure an Azure Key Vault and enable Azure Disk Encryption for the virtual machine. Which of the following is T or UE with regards to Azure Disk Encryption for a Linux virtual machine? It is NOT supported for basic tier virtual machines. B. It is NOT supported for standard tier virtual machines. C. Drive encryption for Linux virtual machine scale sets is supported. D. Custom image encryption is supported. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Both basic and standard VMs support Azure Disk Encryption, so options C and D are true. But Azure Disk Encryption does not automatically encrypt drives on a virtual machine but can be set up via Key Vault. We are collecting events from Azure virtual machines to an Azure Log Analytics workspace. We plan to create alerts based on the collected events. We need to identify which Azure services can be used to create the alerts. Which two services should we identify? Each correct answer presents a complete solution. A. Azure Monitor. B. Azure Security Center. C. Azure Analytics Services. D. Azure Sentinel. E. Azure Advisor. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The two Azure services that can be used to create alerts based on collected VM events are Azure Monitor and Azure Sentinel. These services work together to ensure logs and alerts are captured from Azure resources. We must evaluate the underlined segment to determine its accuracy. Our Azure Active Directory tenant has an Azure subscription linked to it. Our developer has created a mobile application that integrates with Azure Active Directory via OAuth 2 implicit grant type. The mobile app is required to register into Azure Active Directory and must obtain a valid redirect URI from the developer during registration. If the underlined segment is inaccurate, select the accurate option. A no adjustment required. B. A secret. C. A login hint. D. A client ID. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The accurate option is no adjustment required. If you are not adjusting your registration flow or configuration beyond providing the redirect URI, the statement implies that no further adjustments are needed, but in reality, adjustments are necessary to complete the process properly. We manage a network with an on-premises Active Directory domain and an Azure subscription called Subone, which is linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. We sync all on-premises identities to Azure Active Directory and need to prevent the synchronization of users whose given attribute starts with TEST while ensuring minimal administrative effort. Which solution should we use? A synchronization rules editor. V. Web Service Configuration Tool. C. The Azure Active Directory Connect Wizard. D. Active Directory Users and Computers. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To prevent users with a given attribute starting with TEST from being synced into Azure AD while maintaining automatic sync of other users, the most efficient approach is to use Synchronization Rules Editor. This tool allows creating specific rules that exclude the targeted users, ensuring minimal administrative effort. We have created a service endpoint for the subnet, which includes an Azure virtual machine running Ubuntu server. We are preparing to deploy Docker containers to the virtual machine and need to ensure that the containers can access Azure storage resources and Azure SQL databases via the service endpoint. To achieve this, we install the Container Network Interface plug-in. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Yes? We have an Azure subscription that contains 50 virtual machines running Windows Server 2012 R2 or Windows Server 2016. We need to deploy Microsoft anti-malware to these virtual machines. We connect to each virtual machine and add a Windows feature. Does this meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. It is incorrect. Microsoft anti-malware is deployed as an extension and not a feature. We are working with an Active Directory forest containing a single domain named wylandindustries.com. We also manage an Azure Active Directory tenant with the same name. We have been tasked with integrating Active Directory and the Azure Active Directory tenant, and we plan to deploy Azure Active Directory Connect. Our integration strategy must ensure that password policies and user login limitations affect user accounts synced to Azure Active Directory while reducing the number of required servers. Solution: we recommend using pass-through authentication and seamless single sign-on with password hash synchronization. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The given solution uses pass-through authentication with Azure Active Directory Connect, which ensures that Active Directory accounts can sync to Azure Active Directory tenants automatically. This includes seamless single sign-on, allowing users on one directory to access the other effortlessly without manual setup. Password policies are managed internally via single sign-on, reducing the number of required passwords. User logins are handled synchronously across directories. We manage an Azure Container Registry. We have been tasked with assigning a user a role that allows image uploads to the Azure Container Registry while ensuring the role has only the required privileges. Which of the following roles should we assign? A owner, B contributor, C a CR push, D a CR poll. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The most appropriate role to assign for uploading images directly to Azure Container Registry is a CR push. This allows users to upload files without requiring additional permissions beyond basic file handling capabilities. We have created a service endpoint for the subnet, which includes an Azure virtual machine running Ubuntu server. We are preparing to deploy Docker containers to the virtual machine and need to ensure that the containers can access Azure storage resources and Azure SQL databases via the service endpoint. To achieve this, we create an application security group. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. There is no need to create an application security group. Our network includes an on-premises Active Directory domain, which is synchronized with Azure Active Directory. Azure Active Directory Connect is installed on a domain member server. We need to ensure that a domain administrator for the domain can modify synchronization options while adhering to the principle of least privilege. Which Azure Active Directory role should we assign to the domain administrator? A security administrator, B global administrator, C user administrator. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To ensure that a domain administrator for the Adatemcom domain can modify synchronization options in Azure Active Directory Connect. The correct role is the Global Administrator role in Azure Active Directory. We have a hybrid configuration of Azure Active Directory and an Azure Insight cluster within a virtual network. We plan to enable users to authenticate to the cluster using their on-premises Active Directory credentials. To support this authentication, we deploy an Azure Active Directory application proxy. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Incorrect. We have an Azure subscription that contains virtual machines. We enable just-in-time ITVM access for all the virtual machines. We need to connect to a virtual machine using remote desktop. What should we do first? From Azure Directory Privileged Identity Management, activate the Security Administrator user role. From Azure Active Directory Privileged Identity Management, activate the owner role for the virtual machine. From the Azure portal, select the virtual machine, select Connect, and then select Request Access. From the Azure portal, select the virtual machine and add the Network Watcher Agent virtual machine extension. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. When just-in-time virtual machine access is enabled, inbound traffic to virtual machines is restricted. To connect to a virtual machine using Remote Desktop Protocol or SSH, you must request temporary access. We have an Azure subscription, which is linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. With the Global Administrator role assigned, we are responsible for managing Azure Security Center settings. What steps should we take to create a custom sensitivity label? Create a custom sensitive information type. Elevate access for global administrators in Azure Active Directory. Upgrade the pricing tier of the Security Center to Standard. Enable integration with Microsoft Cloud App Security. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The correct answer is A. We use Azure Security Center for centralized policy management across 3 Azure subscriptions. We apply several policy definitions to manage the security of these subscriptions. We need to deploy these policy definitions as a group across all 3 subscriptions. Solution: we create an initiative and an assignment scoped to the tenant root group management group. Does this meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Yes, to deploy Azure policy definitions across multiple subscriptions as a group, the best practice is to use initiatives and management groups. We utilize Azure Resource Manager templates to deploy Azure virtual machines. We need to disable unused Windows features automatically as instances of the virtual machines are provisioned. What should we use? Device compliance policies in Microsoft Intune. Azure Automation State Configuration. Application Security Groups. Azure Advisor. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. You can use Azure Automation State Configuration to manage Azure virtual machines. We have an Azure subscription that is linked to an Azure Active Directory tenant. From the Azure portal, they register an enterprise application. Which additional resource will be created in Azure Active Directory? A. A service principal. B. An AZ-500 certificate. C. A managed identity. D. A user account. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. When an enterprise application is registered in Azure AD, the primary resource created is a service principal within the Azure AD tenant. We manage an Azure subscription, which contains an Azure storage account in the resource group. Users and applications access the blob and file services through various shared access signatures and stored access policies. We discover unauthorized access to both services and need to revoke all access to the storage account. Would creating a new stored access policy meet this requirement? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The suggested solution of creating a new stored access policy for storage account does not fully revoke all access because each resource group has only one SAS unless explicitly configured otherwise. Therefore, it only allows access through that single SAS. We have an Azure subscription. We have an Azure storage account in a resource group. Users and applications access the blob service and the file service in the subscription by using several shared access signatures and stored access policies. We discover that unauthorized users accessed both the file service and the blob service. We need to revoke all access to the subscription. We create a lock on the subscription. Does this meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. It is incorrect. The correct solution involves adjusting the policies on the storage groups associated with the entire resource group going to revoke access. This ensures that all files and blob services in Xeon are denied access. Creating a lock on Xeon does not affect the entire resource group. It only affects its specific storage group within Rgon. Revoking access across the entire resource group requires configuring each storage group in the account to revoke access, which is more comprehensive and accurate for this scenario. We use Azure Security Center for centralized policy management across 3 Azure subscriptions. Several policy definitions are utilized to manage the security of these subscriptions. To deploy these definitions as a group to all 3 subscriptions, a group-based approach is required. Solution: we create a policy definition and assignments scoped to resource groups. Does this meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. It is incorrect. We have been tasked with creating an Azure Key Vault using PowerShell. We have been informed that objects deleted from the Key Vault must be retained for a set period of 90 days. Which 2 of the following parameters must we use in conjunction to meet the requirement? A. Enabled for deployment. B. Enable PRJ protection. C. Enable for template deployment. D. Enable self-delete. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To meet the requirement of keeping deleted objects for 90 days in Azure Key Vault, you need to configure Enable Purge Protection, Enable Soft Delete. These settings work together to maintain the 90-day retention policy. Our Azure subscription includes 100 virtual machines with Azure Diagnostics enabled. We have been tasked with analyzing the security events of a Windows. We have already accessed Azure Monitor. Which of the following options should we use? A. Application log. B. Metrics. C. Activity log. D. Logs. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The appropriate tool for comprehensive security event analysis in this scenario is Logs. Logs provides a broad view of all relevant logs, including application system, user activity, and network data, which are essential for understanding virtual machine. We have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure SQL database. We plan to audit this database. To configure the audit log destination, the solution must meet several requirements: custom query language, support for querying events, minimize administrative effort. What should we configure? A. An event hub. B. A storage account. C. A log analytics workspace. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To effectively audit the Azure SQL database while leveraging custodious query for event querying and minimizing administrative effort, the optimal configuration is a log analytics workspace. We have a hybrid Azure Active Directory configuration consisting of users who run Windows 10 and are integrated with Azure Active Directory. Our SQL database requires connecting via Microsoft SQL Server Management Studio and authenticating using our on-premises Active Directory account. To clarify, we need to inform the developers which authentication method to use, and this process may require further explanation. Which authentication method should be specified for connection? A. SQL login. B. Active Directory Universal with multi-factor authentication support. C. Active Directory Integrated. D. Active Directory Password. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The optimal solution for minimizing authentication prompts while respecting Active Directory accounts involves using Active Directory integrated with multi-factor authentication support. This approach leverages existing security features, reducing the need for extra steps and ensuring secure access without requiring additional password entries. We have an Azure subscription that contains an Azure Key Vault. In it, we create a secret. An application developer registers an application in Azure Active Directory. We need to ensure that the application can access and use secret. What should we do? Well, in Azure AD, create a role. B. In Azure Key Vault. C. In Azure Key Vault, create an access policy. D. In Azure AD, enable Azure AD Application Proxy. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. To ensure your Azure Active Directory application can use the secret created in Azure Key Vault, you need to configure the application proxy and create an access policy. In Azure, you plan to configure a variety of Azure policies that use deploy, if not exist, audit, if not exist, append, and deny effects. Which effect requires a managed identity for the assignment? An audit if no exist. B. Append. C. Deploy if no exist. D. Deny. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The correct answer is deploy if not exist, requires a managed identity for assignment when using policies that include effects like audit if not exist and deploy if not exist. TUPS docs Microsoft Combs Latin Azure governance Cipolisai how to remediate resources. Our company has an Azure subscription that includes two virtual machines, which both have a status of stopped. The virtual machines belong to different resource groups. We have also created two Azure policies that are both configured with the virtual machine's resource type. The policy configured for first resource group has a policy definition of not allowed resource types, while the policy configured for second resource group has a policy definition of allowed resource type. We then create a read-only resource lock on first virtual machine, as well as a read-only resource lock on second resource group. Which of the following is T or UE with regards to the scenario for us? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. When you will create a virtual machine in second resource group, it will give you error. The selected resource group is read-only. Our Azure subscription is linked to our Azure Active Directory tenant. After registering an internally developed application in Active Directory, we are tasked with ensuring that the application can access Azure Key Vault secrets on behalf of the application users. Solution: we configure a delegated permission with no admin consent. Does this solution meet the goal? Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. It is correct. We have an Azure web app and need to set up continuous deployment for web app and using an Azure repo. What should we create first? A. An Azure Application Insight Service. B. An Azure DevOps organization. C. An Azure Storage account. D. An Azure DevTest Labs lab. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. The correct sequence to configure continuous deployment using Azure Repo would involve setting up a DevOps organization first. This structure provides the foundation for managing teams and environments necessary. This option is crucial as it sets up the environment for effective deployment configuration, ensuring proper resource management and collaboration among development and testing teams. We have an Azure Active Directory tenant. We plan to create several security alerts using Azure Monitor. What should we create first to prepare the Azure subscription for the alerts? A. An Azure Storage account. B. An Azure Log Analytics workspace. C. An Azure Event Hub. D. An Azure Automation account. Okay, now pause the video here, have a bit of think, and then continue when you are ready. Basically, you need Log Analytics workspace to store the security-related logs and use Custo to query the logs. Based on the result of query, create security alert. Therefore, you have to create Log Analytics workspace first. Not forget to like and subscribe.